Hi everyone, welcome to episode 48 of the Startup Playbook Podcast. My name is Rohit Bhargava, and each week I interview successful founders, investors, and subject matter experts on how they got started, the strategies they use to succeed, and their advice to current and future entrepreneurs. As you may have noticed, we're just 2 episodes away from episode 50. In the 50th episode, I wanted to do something a little bit different and give an opportunity for listeners of the podcast to ask questions from some of their favorite guests on the show. So send an email to rohit@startupplaybook.co with your question and the guest you want to ask the question to, and I'll pick some of my favorites to feature on the 50th episode. So coming back to episode 48, my guest for today's episode is Dave Scheine. Dave can be considered one of the leading experts when it comes to global expansion. He helped expand Google's offices and launch products such as G Suite in countries like India, Ireland, and Poland, before moving on to join Yelp as their first international hire and help them expand into 30 different countries during his role there as the Director of European Operations and the Director for the Asia-Pacific region. He is now based in Melbourne, where he advises and sits on the board of several startups, angel invests in companies, and is actively helping to grow the Australian startup ecosystem. In the episode, we chat about the metrics Dave looked at when deciding where and how to expand, what makes a good mentor-mentee relationship, and why teams are the most important thing that investors look for. Without further ado, here is my interview with Dave Scheine. Hi Dave, welcome to the Startup Playbook Podcast, and thanks so much for taking the time to be here today.
Thanks, Rohit. Thanks for having me. Excited to hear all questions that you have.
So for those people that are listening at home that may not be as familiar with you or your background, do you want to share your story and sort of what got you here today?
Sure. As you might be able to tell from my accent, I am American. I'm originally from New York. Did my undergrad degree at Stanford and then my MBA at Harvard. Spent about 10 years in the tech digital space, 5 of which at Google, helping launch new Google offices in places as far-flung as India and Poland. Also helped launch new products, including the Google's enterprise product that today is known as G Suite. After 5 years at Google, I joined Yelp as the first international hire based out of London, helped launch Yelp into roughly about 30 different markets globally. I moved down to Australia with Yelp about 3.5 years ago to help expand Yelp not only in Australia, but also Asia Pacific. I left Yelp about 1.5 years ago and have been heavily involved in the startup scene here, particularly in Melbourne. Sit on the board of 2 local startups, have done a little bit of angel investing down here, helping grow the local ecosystem.
Fantastic. And so, one of the things that I've kind of really noticed with all of the guests is that everyone has a very different story and a different journey that they kind of come across. And so kind of going back to the very sort of beginning of your story was, you went to a couple of Ivy League schools as well. And, obviously there's a big sort of story about a lot of people sort of dropping out of uni and going into the startup space.
Yep.
Whereas you've, gone through several different schools and done your MBA. So I just wanted to kind of get your perspective on, how valuable was that for you, and what were some of the things that you took away that you sort of applied to?
Sure. It's funny that you asked that, because when I graduated from Stanford in 2000, so I was there during the first dot-com bubble, and I'd say out of my 6 or 7 closest friends, I was the only one who didn't drop out of Stanford. And so at the time, in the late 90s, it was like, if you're still at school, what are you doing there? You should be off starting some company. The reality is pretty much all my friends, with one exception, all went back to Stanford and eventually graduated. So similarly, when I was at Harvard, I was in school with Jeremy Stoppelman, who was the founder of Yelp. He also dropped out of HBS to start the company, whereas I continued and wound up going to Google and eventually joined Yelp. So it probably says a little bit about me that I'm less of a risk taker than some of my friends who went on to start some pretty amazing companies. But I think a lot of it is that some of it has to do with just timing and exposure more so than anything else. The reason that a lot of my friends dropped out of Stanford was that at the time there was just a lot of money being flown through Silicon Valley, and there was an enormous amount of opportunity. And I think there was a fair bit of peer pressure that why are you still in school when you have this opportunity? I think also back then there was less emphasis on entrepreneurship and innovation in a lot of the universities, even at Stanford. And I think today, fast forward 15, 20 years later, there's a huge emphasis on that, and universities are really focused on how can we make a really innovative curriculum, provide a lot more depth across different curriculums, and also provide people with the projects and the know-how so they can have some of that entrepreneurial skill set. I still think it's a challenge, though, for universities, whereas if you're moving from a theoretical application of topics like innovation and entrepreneurship, you really can't do it unless you actually do it. So one of the things I was lucky when I was at Harvard is we were able to get paired with a bunch of local like startup businesses and help them with specific activities. So this was for like an entrepreneurial marketing class, and that worked really well for me. In particular, I got paired with Rhonda Coleman, who is one of the co-founders of Sam Adams, which is a microbrewery in the US. And she was starting her own brewery, but didn't really know very much about marketing. And so 3 of us from HBS were able to come with her for several weeks and develop like a marketing plan and help her bring her product to market. And that was really useful for me because I was able to apply a lot of the learnings from the classroom. And then it also helped when I was actually looking to get employment afterwards. I had this really specific example of something that I was able to build up from scratch. Which I might not have had like otherwise.
Sure. So, I mean, speaking of peer pressure, like it's interesting that you almost have that peer pressure to stay in school, whereas like over here, a lot of the sort of pressure comes from, potentially why are you taking this risk to start a business. Again, the peer pressure comes in a lot of different forms, but
Sure.
How did you sort of navigate through that, and how did you sort of know that what you were doing was the right path for you? Versus kind of following something that all of your other friends were doing, and as you said, there was a lure of kind of money and sort of money.
Yeah. Well, I started off on the wrong path. So right out of college, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I probably should have went to work for a startup. So I wound up working in consulting. And that was probably the only job I've had in my career that I didn't like. And some of that was pressure from parents. Some of that was pressure from university. Part of it was that there was a whole on-campus recruitment program from a lot of the consulting firms. And you see that here in Australia with consulting firms, banks, other big corporates. And it's very easy to get caught up in that from that kind of peer pressure. And so I went ahead down that path and then quickly realized about a year in that, okay, this is not for me. And then luckily I was able to pivot and wound up working in tech. So I think ultimately it really depends on, you shouldn't really do things because your friends are doing things. It's really about what your values are and what really that you're interested in terms of doing on a day-to-day basis. But the reality is I think a lot of successful people are successful because they're surrounding themselves with the right people who are making the right choices. And that in turn helps dictate like your own way of addressing like issues or questions or decisions that come up.
Yeah. So, like in terms of surrounding yourself with the right people, just kind of diving a little bit deeper to that, how do you sort of find the right people? Again, this is a conversation that I just had yesterday with a friend of mine who we were talking about. A lot of his friends and even his family are sort of pressuring him to give up his business and kind of move more into the corporate space, which will sort of help him do that, and he's finding it really difficult to kind of navigate through that. How do you? It's hard in that type of moment to know that these are the right people and this is the right sort of path for me.
Sure.
It's a lot easier kind of looking back on that. But, how do you? Yeah.
And it's a lot easier, like at a place like Stanford, like it's pretty easy to get surrounded by the right people, whether it's people interested in startups or politics or whatever the area is. It was a challenge for me, like here in Australia, and because there is still a very strong corporate mindset here, where a lot of the really talented folks from university, they want to go work at the ANZ and the Telstras of the world. And so for me, it was really scouting out, understanding who was involved in like the startup ecosystem that have created really interesting businesses, and reaching out to them. I reach out to people on LinkedIn randomly, and usually because of my background and happened to be from the States, they responded, which is great. But the ecosystem is fairly small here, that the response rate, I think, is higher than it might be in Silicon Valley or in London. I also reach out to a lot of people on the financing side. So some of the folks that work in the VCs here in Australia, to understand like where are they investing, where are they seeing the market. The other thing that I did that was really useful is I reached out to other people that have done business here in Australia but are now living in the UK or the US, and they've just connected me to the right folks. Yeah. So I think that the key is trying to find like a hub person who's fairly well connected. And if they're the right person, they're just really interested in helping grow like the scene and the community, and they're more than happy to open doors from that way. I think that's probably the easiest way to go. If you go with a specific agenda that I'm looking to raise this type of money, or I'm like, I want you to be my mentor, it's a lot harder. Yeah. But if you approach it a little broader, that you're really just interested in the space and want to get connected to like-minded people. Yeah. One of the tips I always have is when I meet someone, is always ask like, who should I talk to next? Like, who are the 2 or 3 people that I need to get get introduced to. And it's not really with like a set agenda. It's more that I just want to really meet interesting, like smart people that are passionate about different types of activities.
Sure. I want to come back to some of your experience with different ecosystems and how that sort of relates to Australia, and also the mentoring and the advising aspect that you kind of do at the moment. But I guess fast forwarding from your journey from those sort of early stages to working at Google. So you were with Google for a couple of years.
I was there for just under 5 years.
Yeah. What was that experience like for you?
Yeah, it was crazy. I joined in 2005, so just after the IPO. There were probably about 3,000 employees at Google, most of them in the US. And the company was just growing like crazy. In the course of the 5 years, when I left Google, there were over 30,000 employees. And so to go from like 2,000 to 30,000 in 5 years is pretty crazy. I was really lucky that I joined really early on. I was one of the first MBA hires from Google. At the time, Google had like obscene hurdles to get hired. Like you had to go to Stanford or Harvard, otherwise you couldn't get an interview. And I was really lucky that I met Sheryl Sandberg. She was my boss's boss, and originally the person that helped hire me. And so as part of that initial wave of the early management within the AdWords organization. But what was really cool about it was Google was starting to expand internationally really quickly. And I had the opportunities to go work in India, Poland, and Ireland with Google, and get to experience some really like tremendous like growth. What was really cool is when I moved out to India, there was probably only about 20 or so people in the Gurgaon office, which is inside New Delhi. So even though Google had thousands of employees elsewhere, there's only 20 people in this office. And we were tasked with like scaling it and growing as quickly as possible. And so Thomas and I and the rest of the leadership team there hired over 200 people in a year. And so it sounds really glamorous, but the reality was we were probably interviewing between 40 and 50 people each a week, just to get the exact numbers that we wanted to go through, in an environment that culturally was probably the opposite of the US. I think like Australia is probably I don't know if the Australians would like to not. It's probably like 90-95% the same as the US in terms of culture and how things work. India is probably like 20% the same. So operating in that kind of like dynamic was challenging, but also like exciting. So it was learning like about a new culture and a new way of thinking about things. Yeah, absolutely. Like I mean, I think we were talking about some of these things when we met at the StartMate event a couple of weeks ago. But what are some of the, when you're going through an aggressive sort of growth or scale phase, and you're looking to hire really quickly in a location where culturally it's very different to what you're experienced to? What were some of the kind of the less obvious obstacles that you sort of face? Yeah, some of these are very India specific, and then I can talk later about just like scaling and growing at that rate and what you want to do and not do to make sure it works well. India, we were hiring a lot of folks that were fairly young. Most of them were like 19 or 20, just graduated from university. They were probably about 90% women, which was different than I've ever seen in any other tech world. Part of that was we were hiring folks that were doing account management and customer support for the North American market. And so the level of English needed to be really strong. And the level of English needed to be trained so folks can respond in either American English or British English, not Indian English. And that tended to be people that came from certain disciplines in college. And so we had this interesting pool that we're working from. The other thing that was really interesting that really surprised me is a lot of folks in like emerging markets in India in particular, right after they graduate from university, they're still living at home. And so a lot of the folks who were hiring, their parents would bring them to the office, and then the parents would wait in the lobby of the office while Thomas or I would go do the final round interviews. It was fascinating. That doesn't happen like in the States or here in Australia. And so when you would bring the candidate back outside, the parents would immediately want to come up to you and ask you all sorts of questions because you're basically being entrusted with their son or their daughter for the foreseeable future. And so that was just a very different dynamic. We even did a couple of things on the recruitment side to really help like address that. So we did one night where we had like a parents' night at the office, which I've never seen any other tech company do this, where we actually invited all the coworkers at Google to bring their parents to the office so they can see what the environment was like. And the parents would then go back to the communities, talk to other parents about what a great place this is and such wonderful people at Google, and encourage their children to apply as well. So it was kind of a weird kind of dynamic we were to try to increase the pool of applicants for Google.
And obviously with Yelp you were sort of part of really expanding your product out into different locations as well. Can you kind of talk through some of the things that you were involved with over there?
Yeah, so with Yelp, I looked at a few different things. So 1/3 was helping figure out the international strategy. So that's the international playbook. So what's our like go-to-market strategy for each of these countries? Do we do it ourselves? Do we partner with someone, or we do an acquisition? Another third was scaling and ramping up the initial like sales and operations part of the business, and a lot of that was recruiting the right folks who would be the voice of Yelp with the business community in the markets that we operate in. And then the last third was more like partnerships and corporate development. Yelp, although today it's a $3 billion company, it's still run like a scrappy startup, and so we didn't necessarily have the same resources that we had with Google, which we can throw a lot of money and mind share at to solve problems. So we had to really think outside the box, and a lot of the marketing we did was ourselves through like event marketing and PR, but some of it was also through partnerships and promotions as well. So some of the cool partnerships I got to work on was helping do a partnership with Daimler Chrysler, so to get Yelp and Dash and Mercedes-Benz. Did some partnerships with a couple of big telcos, so Yelp could get promoted and hopefully preloaded on some of the phones as well.
Very cool. And so, like you mentioned, that part of your role with them was kind of working out the international strategy.
Yeah.
It was a combination of, do we acquire people? Do we sort of partner up with people? What were some of the things that you were looking for
Sure.
to help you form the right sort of strategy?
Yeah, so it was a combination of two things. One was very like metrics driven, and so really like understanding like the markets at like a macro level, and so understanding like how many internet users do they have? What's like mobile penetration? What's smartphone penetration? What's like the GDP per capita? So kind of to help stack rank the countries. Because one of the challenges we had at Yelp is we were only going to really do one or two at a time. And so how do you prioritize between South Korea versus Germany versus France? So one of the ways is just looking at the raw metrics. The second thing we looked at was just also the complexity needed to actually like localize and create a local experience for that product. As you can imagine, like launching in Japan would be a lot more complicated than launching in Canada, which would be fairly similar to the US and not as many localization tweaks. And so there's some product things that we looked at. Another big area would be payments, just because that's the one thing that was kind of surprising to me is that I just assumed that, we just pick one provider and all of a sudden we can accept credit cards around the world. Unfortunately, that doesn't work that way. Even though like companies like Stripe are great, they're only in a handful of markets. And so really understanding like, do we have to partner locally? How costly is that? How much engineering time is needed for that? And then the last thing is just relying really heavily on local knowledge. And so one of the things that we always did as a company is we would kind of parachute in like a landing team just to really understand the market, really try to chat with as many people as possible, both in the tech ecosystem, but also in the case of Yelp, the small business ecosystem as well, to really understand the dynamics of the market so we can feed back some information back to the product team so they can tweak the product, but also to make decisions on really like who are the types of people that we want to hire and how do we need to like come to market that might be slightly different than what we've done in other countries.
Yeah. I guess one of the things that we were talking about before we turned on the mic was, you were essentially looking for a couple of people that would sort of help you get a solid foothold of the market and help you with the hiring process. Really curious to know, like, what was it specifically that you were looking for in those one or two sort of, I guess, leadership positions within countries that ensured that that they would help form like I guess building a pillar that you could sort of build the growth.
Yeah, so I think there's two components to that. One is typically, especially if we're scaling into having a presence in terms of an office and eventually dozens of people, was having the right landing team that can help bring the culture over from like corporate HQ and instill that with all the new hires. And so we looked at doing a couple different things. One is we tended to bring one person who was over senior who could oversee that operation. And then also a handful of like ground staff, like line staff, who are actually doing the day-to-day job. And a lot of other folks that I've spoken to, they really do the first part. So they'll send someone senior over, but then that person might be fairly removed from the day-to-day and doesn't know the intricacies, like if the product breaks or if we have this weird kind of email issue, like how do you resolve it? Because they're so removed from the details. So for us, it was important to have like folks that were relatively junior, but also have been in the organization for 1 or 2 years that really understood all the processes, because they're the ones that actually know the ins and outs and who to contact if things go wrong or right. So that was pretty important. I think there's also some cultural things as well to look at. And some of that is whether or not folks could be really adaptive and be in an environment where they don't have the same support and resources that they might have, both from a company perspective, but also from like a family perspective. And so we've moved a handful of people over for Yelp in London. One of the folks asked to go back early because she was really close to her family and didn't realize that she's not going to be able to go home once a month because she was, 10 hours away in the UK. And so those are things just to like subtly look at, even though she was like a fantastic employee, probably ticked all the boxes in terms of being able to help scale our growth, but just wasn't like ready and committed to being like so removed from her support structure in the States.
Sure. And obviously, so you've had experience in looking at international expansion like Asia, Europe, Australia, all with very different sort of cultures and sort of different challenges, I imagine. But what were some of the commonalities that you found between successful sort of international expansion strategies across those different regions?
Yeah, I think one is to go really local. And so it's one thing if you just translate the website either with paid translators or like through machine translations and just launch it. And a lot of companies do that and say that we're global. I think what was great about Yelp is we really made sure that we had like a presence on the ground in each of the markets, particularly so we knew what kind of tweaks that we needed to do beyond just language changes on landing pages and on UI changes as well. So for like example, like in Japan, how people get directions for local businesses is very different than it is in the US or the UK, and I would not have known that. Like they don't have a grid system, so you can't say like, I think we're in 114 William Street and it's like between these two streets. You don't really do that in Japan, and that's not really how people look for businesses. And so in Japan, it was really about like, okay, what train station is closest? When I exit the train station, what door do I get out of and go from there? And so it's just like slightly like subtle differences, but the commonality across all the markets is we had someone on the ground who was kind of knowledgeable that was able to feed that back to the States and in the case of Yelp.
Sure. And so like, I guess looking at it from a startup perspective, when do you think is the right time for startups to think about to seriously consider looking at international expansion and potentially having a presence in different locations?
Yeah. Well, there's so many factors that come into play. A lot of it is like how much money and resources do you have?
Yeah. And
prioritizing that versus like, have you determined what your model is locally? So if you don't have a model and you haven't figured out kind of what the business model is, then you're probably too premature. Yeah. But one of the advantages, I think, especially in countries like Australia, because it's a lot smaller, you can think globally a lot earlier on, realizing that if you want to be like a $1 billion or a $10 billion company, it's really hard to do that if you're just focused on the domestic market here. And that was the same for much of the European countries as well, that you're in the mindset is like, okay, whatever we're doing, is this applicable like globally as well? And I think having that mindset early on helps. But in terms of when you're ready to go, I think you have to have some degree of confidence in terms of the model and the processes that you have in place here. Because as difficult it is to launch something from scratch here, imagine taking that and taking it to a foreign culture that's many time zones away can be really difficult. The other thing is making sure that you have the right people on the ground who can help you to do that, because most successful companies have relocated people either temporarily or permanently from the initial company or the initial startup. And that, obviously, if you're a startup, it's really scrappy because you might only have one marketing person and you can't really just take that marketing person and all of a sudden move them over to China. Yeah. And so making sure that there is a little bit of redundancy and you have enough people on board that you can actually have the ability to send someone over to help build their presence in that market.
Sure. And in terms of, like you've touched on this a couple of times, but in terms of, when you're aggressively hiring and really looking to sort of build a presence in a particular location, what are the sort of structures that you put in place to ensure that, that you're creating an environment where you're not just bringing people on, but you're creating an environment where people can succeed?
Yeah, so I think it's a few things. One is scaling rapidly, but not too rapidly. Yeah. And so there's examples of companies that scaled too rapidly. Like I think Groupon is probably like the most famous one, where they grew from like 0 to like 5,000 employees in like 10 months, which as crazy as Google grew, that was just crazy, where you had folks that were 2 months in managing people that were a month in who were like a week in. And as a result, like a lot of the culture kind of like dies with that. Mm-hmm. And so you want to grow at a scale that you can actually maintain like the cultures and the value system that you have in your organization, I think is important. And then hiring is really key. So one of the things that I've always done is I try not to use recruitment agencies. We try to do everything ourselves where possible, but still managing things like at scale. So like at Google, where we're interviewing 40 people a week, you have to have really robust processes to do that. So we manage that kind of like a sales funnel. So instead of selling widgets, we were actually like in the process of acquiring people for the organization, and then having a really strong hiring bar. Because one of the things is if you're in a smaller satellite office like internationally, there's not as many peers that you can learn from in terms of this is like kind of the bar and this is kind of how the culture should be for the organization. So making sure that you're hiring the right person is even more important. One of the other things that I've seen work as well is if you don't have a strong landing team, is then whoever you're hiring, assuming you have the resources and the capital to do that, is sending them back to like HQ for a number of weeks so they can be ramped up and trained and really understand the business. But hiring and recruitment is arguably, I think that's always like the most important thing. It's not always maybe the sexiest thing. People always want to work on partnerships or do some strategic marketing thing, but actually making sure that you're bringing on the right people really early on is pretty important. And especially I'm American, so we don't have labor laws really. We do have labor laws in the States, but they're not as robust as they would be here in Australia, and they're certainly not as robust as they would be in places like France and Germany. And so if you do make a hiring mistake, it's going to be a lot more costly, both from a money perspective, but also like a time perspective. So you really want to make sure that you do that properly. And then you also do it within the right like constraints of the legal system and the law as well. And so in that case, you might have to have like either a consultant or an HR consulting firm like advise you to make sure you're adhering to all like the right processes in place, because the laws like are completely different. Even between Australia and New Zealand, the laws are fairly different.
Yeah, of course. And so that kind of brings me back to again kind of looking at you've had experience in looking at sort of ecosystems all around the world.
Yeah.
How does Australia compare to some of the other sort of communities or places that you've seen businesses operate?
Australia, the ecosystem here is a couple of dynamics. It's still really nascent, and so I think it's starting to grow, and I think we're starting to see a lot of the signs that it's going to be really large in the coming years. And some of the signs for that is there's starting to be some big exits, and I think that really like helps power the ecosystem. So I think the Atlassian like IPO is like a huge win for the Australia ecosystem, and now there's a next tier of companies that could ultimately be unicorn type companies. And I think that's really important. I think that's starting to happen here. I think that the challenges in Australia is that it's spread out are largely between two cities, between Sydney and Melbourne, and so it's not as concentrated as it might have been like in the UK within Silicon Roundabout or Tech City in London. The financing still needs to improve here, so I'm working with a handful of startups right now, and fundraising, especially at the angel seed round level, is really challenging here because there's not as developed of an angel network, in part because there's not as many people who've like had big exits where they can invest back in the community. And so I think that's definitely like a challenge here. One of the things that I thought was really interesting that I hadn't seen in the States is there are a lot of middlemen here that help connect you for financing. So for a fee, they'll introduce you to all sorts of high net worth individuals. And I think it does play a role because it might be really challenging for people to get access to that funding. But it's kind of weird because it's not adding as much value, or it's much more valuable if the startups are directly working with angels who have experience in that area of the startup world. It's just the startup scene here is just not mature enough yet for that. But I think we're starting to see things move in that direction. Sure.
What would you like to see more of in Australia?
I think for people to think a little bigger in terms of like the startups, so thinking global from day one and being more aggressive with goals. I would love to see more technical co-founders, because one of the other things that's a little funny here is it's a generalization, but there's a lot of founders that come from a business mindset, which is great, and I'm from a business mindset, but there's not as many like strong, really like technical / product folks who are really like focused on building something from that perspective. And so I meet a lot of at these little like startup meetups, a lot of business founders, and they're all looking for a technical co-founder. And so I think there needs to be more of that. The education system is really great in Australia. Here in Melbourne, we have like 3 great universities with like Monash, RMIT, Uni of Melbourne. And they are producing like some really strong tech talent, but a lot of that tech talent is not focused on being a product manager or being a startup founder. They're still focused on like, I can make a lot of money working at A and Z. Yeah. And so I think there needs to be a switch in that kind of mindset, because I think that's, in addition to the funding gap, that I think is the biggest challenge here, is just more being able to find a lot of the startup founders that are either technical or more product focused than anything else.
Yeah, I can't remember who it was, but I remember having a conversation a few months ago about, and someone said, again, a general sort of perception that they had was there's a lot of business model innovation versus a technical innovation that kind of happens.
Yeah, there's exceptions to that, and we're seeing some great companies come up. But I also am seeing a lot of like Me Too business ideas that are just like tweaking something that exists in the US, and that's because it's not being driven from a product perspective, it's being driven from a business model perspective.
Sure. And yeah, so speaking of kind of startups, you're obviously working with a couple of startups at the moment, both in sort of board member advisory sort of roles. What is it specifically that you look for in startups that you want to get involved with?
Yeah. So one is the team. So like who's working on the business. So for example, I'm working with a company called Honey.
Yeah, love those guys.
It's awesome. My friend Matt Jones is the CEO and the founder. They have a really strong team. They're in the search and discovery space for beauty and wellness, and they also do have a SaaS play to help like hair salons manage their inventory and bookings. But Matt and his team came from a similar background. A lot of them worked from Zomato, which purchased Urban Spoon, and they helped scale that business. So they really understood the market dynamics and how it takes to scale a business, and had that kind of background. So I think that really helps, and that's why I was excited from day one when Matt asked me if I wanted to get involved. Yeah. So I think the team is the most important thing, because I have seen some startups here where they want to start the business, but they don't have the team in place and want to raise money to like build the team. But that's kind of like the opposite of how it works, because most investors are going to be investing in the team. Because the reality with most startups, everyone has a great idea, but most ideas evolve. And chances are that business model and that approach and the product is going to evolve over many years. And you need the right team that's flexible enough and hungry enough to really take that to market and win. Yeah. So I think team is number one. Two is the space. And so is it big enough to really be, whether it's just Australia focused or ideally globally focused, that there's enough runway that they can actually like do that. And then last one, and they go hand in hand, is like, is the team the right people? Do they have the right people in place that they can actually like execute like on that vision? But kind of team and kind of like market size are the most important thing. I've been working with really small fledgling companies. I think for more sophisticated investors than me who are doing more later stage things, at that point, then you can see what kind of traction does the business have? What does their product look like? How's the market fit? Yeah. In the early stage, you're really relying on like team and market, and then like some inkling in terms of, okay, what kind of product do they have to address whatever gap there is in the market today.
Sure. And I guess kind of flipping that, in terms of sort of startups that are looking for advisory board members or advisors to kind of help them through the process, what should they look for in someone? Again, there are people that sort of offer this service for a fee and those sort of things. So what's your sort of perspective on paying someone to come on board as an advisor to the business, and also what are some of the things that you recommend in someone finding the right advisor or mentor for their business?
Well, I'll start with the second question, because I think that's the most important one, because if you're not finding the right person, it doesn't matter whether or not you're paying or not. And I think you always have folks who's just like, oh, I need a mentor, or I need an advisor, and that's just weird and awkward. For if I just came to you and it's like, can you be my mentor? Like, that's just weird. Where I think it's a lot more helpful is if you realize that there's specific gaps or specific areas of expertise that you're more interested in. And I think for a startup, that's probably like more helpful to have lots of different advisors. Like, I need someone who's really good at growth, like marketing, or I'm someone who's really like understands capital fundraising, or someone that's really like on the legal accounting side of the business, or someone that's more of a technical product guy, or someone who's done things internationally. So I think it's much more specific, and it's also helpful if someone approaches you if they have a very specific need in mind. I think so. I think that from like, generally is pretty good, and it's good to have a diverse set of opinions. Because I might say something to a startup, but I'm not the rule of law, and that's just my opinion. And the founder might have a vision, and it might be very different. They definitely should take it to heart and consider it. But I think it's good to get different perspectives on that. So I think the advice there is definitely look at what your needs are and try to find people that have specific experiences in that areas who have kind of done it before. So at least you don't make the same kind of mistakes that like people like myself have made many times before. In terms of paying, I especially if it's a really early stage startup, I'd be really like skeptical of paying just because you don't have like the money or the resources for that. It's probably better to see, do you have a good rapport? Are they adding value? And then later on, then discuss, is there some sort of like equity that you can get as being on the board or advisory role and so forth. I think the ecosystem, and one of the benefits I think of Australia is that because the ecosystem is still pretty nascent, it still has a very much more community kind of feel. And I think there's a stronger willingness for people to help other folks out, maybe not in a formal capacity, but at least in an informal capacity. But I think especially if you're thinking about like adding someone to like a board, it's much better, can you work with them informally and see what kind of advice, either opening doors or like specific tactical advice that they can help you with, and work more informally before you're like, okay, I'm going to pay you, $100K or whatever it is to guide me on marketing.
Yeah, I've always had mentors or advisors for my business, and I've never had to ask them to be my mentor. It's always been like, we've just gotten along. It's someone that I've been able to kind of call on if I've had questions. Yeah, I feel like a lot of it is, as you said, it's all about rapport and like, do you get along? Are they interested? Can they sort of add value on both sides as well?
Yeah, and part of it, like I wasn't an advisor to Yelp in the early days, but every time I was back in San Francisco, I would catch up with Jeremy and we'd just go for lunch and we were just talking about his business and what was going on. And I had the perspective of, coming from Google at the time, but it was never really going to be more than that. It was just more that like I wanted to help him to do well, and he had questions about some of the stuff I worked on. And then eventually it turned out I wound up joining the company and setting up the business in Europe. But it's similar for a lot of the advising stuff. It was similar to how I got involved with Honey, which is Matt Jones' startup. We just caught up all the time. He was working at Zomato, which was kind of a competitor to Yelp, but we would just talk about the space, about what we're seeing, who's dodgy, who should not be working with, and just general kind of feedback in that area. And then eventually it made sense to kind of make it more formal when he was off to do Honey. Yeah. So a lot of these things, I think it's a lot better if they happen like organically as opposed to forced. I think it's easier to say that if you're just starting a business and all of a sudden it's like, I don't really know anything about growth marketing, what to do. Yeah. But in that case, I think it's easier if you have like a very specific question or area that you need expertise on, and then use that kind of as the entry point as to see if there could be a broader kind of like mentor or advisor type relationship. Yeah,
and as you said, I mean, most people, especially in Australia, seem to be willing to grab a coffee and just have a chat, or at least point you in the right direction if.
Yeah, I've never had anyone say no to me in terms of getting a coffee. And so I think people are pretty willing to do that. And if they're not willing or they don't have the time to do it themselves, it's always helpful to ask is like, do you recommend anyone else that I could speak to?
Yeah, absolutely. Dave, thanks a lot for your time today. I know that you've got a flight to catch later.
Yeah, going to Europe in like 6 hours.
So for anyone that wants to sort of find out a little bit more about you, get in touch, find out more about your story, what's the best way for them to do that?
They can reach out to me either on LinkedIn, or I'm happy to give my email address. It's dscheine@gmail.com.
Perfect. I'll make sure those links are in the show notes. Cool. Thanks so much for your time today and for sharing your insights and experiences, and hope you have a good trip.
Cool. Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure.
Cheers. Thanks for listening to episode 48 of the Startup Playbook Podcast. You can find the show notes of my interview with Dave, along with a curated list of tools and resources for startup founders at startupplaybook.co. As always, you can join the conversation through our Twitter account. The handle is @PlaybookStartup. Next week, I'll be interviewing Duncan Anderson, the co-founder and director of Edrollo. Duncan left a career with Goldman Sachs and Google to found Edrollo, which provides curriculum-focused video lessons, exam practice, and study planning tools for Year 12 students, teachers, and schools. Duncan and his co-founders went through the StartMate program in 2013, and since then have seen a large growth in the company, working with over 100 schools across Australia and more than doubling their team to over 60 staff over the last year. In the episode, we talk about finding product market fit, growth through retention, and the cycles of learning. Don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with our latest episodes, and don't forget to email me the questions you have for episode 50. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you at episode 49 next week.